Hi, welcome to Minds Behind Maps. I'm Maxim Linneman, and this is the latest episode in this experiment where I want to sit down with people who are creating and using anything geospatial to try to understand more about the field and the people in it. My guest today is April Speight, who currently leads the Spatial Computing Technology team at Microsoft within Cloud Advocacy. Her role revolves around understanding the tech behind some concepts we'll touch upon in this conversation, mostly augmented and virtual reality, then applying that knowledge through raising awareness and helping developers work for these platforms. We do touch quite extensively on April's role at Microsoft, starting by defining what mixed and virtual realities are. From then, we explore multiple topics from how COVID has impacted people's relationship to augmented and virtual reality. I, for one, got into VR more than I might have if it hadn't been for staying at home so much. But we also mentioned some of the privacy concerns and how this goes in hand with technical literacy and education. One of the reasons I was most looking forward to having this conversation with April was to hear more about her journey. She started working in the fashion industry in retail, which we'll go over, and then worked her way up to working into tech, to where she is now at Microsoft. I'd heard of her story through a series of tweets, but wanted to know more about what the journey was like. As you might know if you've listened to previous episodes, I do like learning how people end up to where they are today, and more importantly, why they took some of the decisions they did. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is understanding how people with experience in completely different fields can bring in new, literally out of the box perspectives and ideas. This is one of these conversations. If you'd ask me what field was at the most opposite of the world of computer science and tech, I do think fashion would be high up on that list. Turns out there's actually quite a lot in common, as you'll hear. This is also a conversation about branding and what tech companies can take away from it. As always, you can head over to mindsbehindmaps.com to find all the previous show notes, including the ones for this episode, as well as a form to reach out to me if you want to. You can also follow me or the podcast on Twitter, that's where I'm mostly present, to stay up to date with the new releases. That's at Max Lunneman for me and at Minds Behind Maps for the podcast. With that said, here's my conversation with April Speight. Hi, April. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. I am very excited about this conversation. I start all of these asking the same question to everybody, so I'd like to ask it to you as well. I like asking people how they describe themselves. So I'd like to ask, how would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as a woman of many fabulous hats. there's this thing about me where there's not any one thing that I'm known for. And so because of that, there happens to be just a variety of different areas of interest that I have. And then every so often, I find a new hobby to take on, and I end up pursuing that. And so, depending on who you talk to about me, their idea of who I am and what I do is probably definitely going to change because different folks know me for different things that I do. And so, naturally, just a woman of many fabulous hats.
Could you go over some of those hats? Like if we were to ask a bunch of different people around
Mhm.
you, like who you would be?
Yeah. Yes. So, for one hat, you would likely hear that I am very much into fashion. And a lot of that is because I came from the luxury fashion industry before coming into tech, and I spent years in doing that. And even though I now work in tech, I still very much show up as this fashion forward person because that part of me will never leave. And so you'll get folks who see that side of me. The other side of me is someone who does who's known for doing things in Python and the programming language. And because of that, or that is because when I was starting out with programming, I did a lot of things with Python. And then that subsequently led to me publishing 2 books on Python. So a lot of folks know me for that. Then there's the other side where I also work within the extended reality space. And so as I embarked on that journey, a lot of people got to know me there. Then there's a side of me that's really into doing different types of crafts. And so I've done a variety of different things to create. I've done sewing and designing. I just recently got into punch needling. I also learned how to make shoes. I started doing hand lettering or brush lettering, if you will. So there's that side of me. Then there's also the side of me who really likes just going shopping in general. You can always count on me for anything shopping related. Then there's a side of me that's really into just 90s nostalgia, 90s and 80s nostalgia. So folks will know me for things like that. There's a side of me that's really into roller skating. I just picked that up recently. And so it's always this kind of aha moment where, oh, and also I did bodybuilding. And so there's always this kind of aha moment where someone who knows me really for just one thing, when they learn about another area of my life, they're like, oh, I didn't know you did that. And I'm just like, well, yeah, there was no reason for me to ever bring it up. So I just never talked about it. And those are just some of the hats. They come up here and there. And I don't, honestly, I think the only people who really know every area of my life is likely like my mom and my dad, and then my partner. That's it. Everyone else, they just have like bits and pieces of me here and there.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I that's one of the reasons why I was excited to talk with you, is to actually get to take the time to go over a little bit of some of those different facets. And like, actually, yeah, I'd like to go back, if we could start from when you were working in fashion. Could you go
Mhm.
back there and like explain like a little bit what that journey was like? Because you don't come across every day someone who's like, yeah, I was in fashion and then I went into tech. Like those, if you ask me to take something, as to me at least, that sounds as far possible from tech as possible, that's probably one of the things that would come up. And the more I was learning about your journey, the more I found it really interesting. So I'd like to hear it from you as to what that journey was like.
Yes. So I started working in fashion without the intention of working in fashion, believe it or not. So if I go back just a tad bit further, throughout high school, I always wanted to have a job, but my mom wanted me to focus on what I was learning in school, so my academics and such. So didn't get to work. And then when I got to college, it was more so a matter of, okay, time for you to get a job. And so I said, okay. And I thought to myself, well, if I have to work, I'd rather it be somewhere that I'm going to get some benefit out of it outside of like obviously getting a paycheck. And so I figured working in retail would be great because I knew I would get discounts. And that's how I ended up working in fashion. And so something that really should have just been for a season, because I told myself I'd do it to hold me over, I ended up being in fashion for like 6 or 7 years after that. And from being in that particular space, it grew from necessity because I just needed spending money in college to suddenly becoming something that I considered as an actual career. And so I personally only ever stayed in the luxury space. That I was very intentional about because the way I saw it, that was going to pay the most. And in addition to that, that was a sort of environment I was used to growing up. And so I found that that was going to be more so my sweet spot of working in fashion. And so the first job that I had in fashion is with Juicy Couture. They are, I believe, now back on the scene. I know at one point they were gone. And I had came, if for anyone that's listening to this podcast, I came to Juicy Couture, if you're familiar with the brand, I came to Juicy Couture when they did away with their brand Dirty English, which was their men's line. And so from there, they just had the regular Juicy Couture. And it was a very interesting experience. That's really when I got to know about branding as a whole, because being there, we treated everyone as though they were our BFFs. And that was what we were told to have the mindset of. And literally, when we would add people to our client books, we didn't call them clients, we called them our BFFs. And that's just how strong their branding was there. And so, even from reaching out to them and then being in the store shopping with them, that was that feel that we gave. And so after being there, I've been to other places. I more or less kind of upgraded because from there I went to Neiman Marcus and also Club Monaco and then later Saks Fifth Avenue. But over that time, I got to really get an idea of what it was I actually wanted to do in fashion. And so for me, I really fell in love with doing visual merchandising and then being a menswear stylist. And so visual merchandising, if you're not familiar, they're basically the folks who make the store look nice. And they're the ones that are doing all the folding on the tables. They're the ones that's doing the store windows. They're the ones that's rearranging things. And I really fell in love with it because it was my chance to really play at work, and it felt as close to making art as possible. So when it comes to doing the store windows, first and foremost, it's not something that we did during the middle of the day. It was an overnight job, and I would say it started probably around 8 p.m. and we didn't go home sometimes until as late as 6 a.m. And that was literally doing the store windows and rearranging the store for the new collection that's coming in. And doing the store windows for Club Monaco specifically wasn't just a matter of changing the mannequins, and that was it. That was probably the very last thing we did. Club Monaco at the time, they had very elaborate store windows where you get the art supplies you need, or some of the art supplies that you need. You'll have a directive from corporate. And from there, you just got to make it work. You have to design things the way they want it to be designed. So at one point, I remember, this always comes to mind, it was this display in the window where there were just books everywhere, and we had to attach them to like the walls and everything. And so corporate only gave us but so much, and we didn't have a hammer. Of all things, we didn't have a hammer, and the hammer was going to be useful for nailing the books to the actual wall. And so we were like, okay, how are we going to do this? And lo and behold, for whatever reason, we had a mallet, which, isn't quite a hammer, but it's in the hammer family. And so we used that and it worked. But what that really taught me was the importance of being resourceful, because you're not always going to have what you need to do your job. And so that part of the job was really cool. The menswear stylist was also a really good job for me as well. I had never really been much into women's fashion, believe it or not. So when I tell people that, they're shocked to hear it. But for me, it's always been menswear fashion. And a lot of men will probably say that their fashion choices are limited, but in my personal opinion, I feel like it's actually a matter of whether you know how to actually dress. So, so not to offend anyone who feels like, oh, wait, what do you mean? But it's true. There's just so many different ways to style yourself. And from being within menswear, I was really fond of suiting. And so that was one area that I got really good at. And being here in California now, no one really wears suits. So it's like sad. But back on the East Coast, which is where I was working, it was like the norm to wear business suits. And so it was a really good area to be in that space. And then also, if I'm being realistic, I was a young woman working in suiting. And so men love that. They want to work with you. They want help with everything. And so it was a really good place to be. And I really loved it. Ironically, that's how I met my partner as well. But it was a really cool job. I got to do a lot more with that particular role around clienteling and also product knowledge. And product knowledge itself entails really knowing a product inside and out beyond the fact that it's blue and it costs like $300. There's so much more that goes into it, especially when you're in the luxury space, because I would say probably about 80% of the luxury customer base, they know and understand quality. So you have to do a little bit more to them than just say that this is by Balenciaga. That, I mean, it only means but so much to them. You really have to be able to get that point across as to why this item costs $1,000. And the only way you get to that point is by really understanding product, where it came from as well. And so I share those things with regards to my journey in fashion, because a lot of that helped shape when I came into the tech and what I do now. And so though from a very far view, it may not seem that there was overlap. What I've learned over time is that there's actually been significant overlap with regards to that. But I was in fashion for 6 or so years. And when I decided to exit, it was literally due to the fact that I just wanted more money. Working in retail, you're only going to get so far financially unless you work in corporate. And then even once you get to corporate, you really kind of cap out at a certain amount that you can make, depending on the role, of course. And for me, I always felt that there was more that I could achieve in that space. But I'm going to be honest with you, sometimes like I miss it a lot, being in that world. Even today when I go shopping, it's something that you feel when you walk into a store. It's like I don't know how else to describe it. Like, if you think about your most favorite experience you've ever had and just that feeling that you get, that's literally the feeling I get every time I go into a store. It's just something about the clothing, and it's something about the environment. And now that I work from home, I don't get that. I get my house because I work from home. So like I feel excited to be at home, but I'm not able to get that same feeling now that I work in tech. And so I still do my best to try to do things here and there that still involve the fashion industry. But for where I'm at today, career wise, I am happy where I am, but fashion is a part of me and it'll always be a part of me. And plus, it's the personalities are great in that space. Well, some aren't great. Um, but when you're working directly with clients, because when I was at Saks, it was in their personal styling section of the store, and that was just women's styling. So that was newer for me. It was a really great chance to really get to learn more about where people were coming from, I would say, just because that particular role, you were really a lot more one-on-one with clients, and we really gave them the whole shebang when they came to the store. I feel like not many places do this nowadays because times have changed, but long, long ago, if anyone's into the fashion shopping experience, there was shopping was like a whole experience, and a lot of stores at the like big department stores at the time, they had like restaurants inside them, they had hair salons inside them. When you came and shopped, it was just like a big thing. You had someone catering to you, they probably provided you lunch as well, and so you're probably thinking to yourself, you don't see any of that today, because it's true. You don't see any of that today because times have changed. People are just so quick to get in and out of stores, which is really unfortunate. But when I worked at Saks, we literally gave you all that. Everything that I just said, minus the restaurant, was what we had when I was working at Saks, which was pretty cool. So I kind of felt kind of old school being able to experience that. But the clientele there, they were an older clientele. And in terms of older, I would probably say right around my mom's age now, as all the way up to like my grandmother's age. And those women, they taught me a lot about just life in general. They've lived a lot of life, and they had a lot of thoughts and opinions with regards to what really does and doesn't matter in life at the end of the day. And I feel that because of that role, it kind of more or less aged me, not in a bad way, but it gave me this kind of mindset of really being very deeply introspective and being very analytical when it comes to seeing how life is and really understanding what does and doesn't matter at the end of the day. And like, plus they're just funny. So it was always fun to speak with them. But that was my time in fashion. It was great. And some of my oldest and dearest friends were because I worked in fashion. And though none of us actually work in fashion today, I'm very thankful for those friendships that were made.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm very curious still. Like you mentioned, the biggest driver was you wanted to make more money. Like how
Mhm.
does like that's the motivation. Now, how does that actually happen? Because
Yeah.
like how do you go from like, oh, tech is probably a place where I could make more. So
Mhm.
how do you get in there?
Yeah, that was also very unintentional. So when I was in undergrad, I pursued a certificate in business project management. And the way I landed on that while I was doing my degree in international business, the way I landed on that was I didn't know what project management was, first and foremost, but I knew I liked managing things. And so when I discovered that this was something I could do, I said, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and give that a try. And so you're probably also been wondering, well, how did you even land there? So if I go back even further, if I go back even further than that, I would say my senior year of college, I married my ex-husband. And so in that transition during my life, I had to relocate to another state, but I wasn't done with college yet, and I didn't want to drop out of college. And so while doing that transition, I was able to find a program for military spouses. And that program was very limited in what you could pursue doing. And I was trying to find something that was as close to possible as the major that I had, but I couldn't find anything. And as I was going over the programs available with the advisor, she had I think maybe I had noticed a business project management and I inquired about it and I looked more into it. And that's when I realized, okay, this is about managing things and organizing projects. And I said, I like doing that. I can go ahead and pursue that. It'll be temporary. I don't know if you all notice at this point, temporary things end up being long-term impact in my life. But so I started doing that because I didn't want to like stop doing college. I didn't want my loans to kick in because I had student loans, and that was a big driver of doing that program until I was able to enroll in another college. And so as I was doing that, I kept with it. I did enroll in another college so I can finish my degree. And then all along, I'm doing this project management thing. And I'm like, okay, this is cool. I could see myself doing something like this in a career. And so that's how I ended up pursuing the certificate. Now, fast forward, when I decided that I wanted to leave fashion, I was nearing graduation and I started looking around the internet for project management jobs. At the time, I didn't know there was a tech tie-in to project management. And I think today, today there's for whatever reason, there's a lot of jobs really primarily in project management, but it isn't just in tech. At the time though, when I was looking, the majority of the project management roles I came across were in tech or in construction. And so I said, construction is like a hard no. And then with tech, I'm like, wow, there are a lot of jobs in tech and project management, but at no point did my professors mention anything about the tech industry when we were learning about project management. So then I realized, I said, all right, if I want to get a new job, and from what I'm understanding, there's money working in project management, I don't have that tech part on paper, but like I'm not tech illiterate. So I got to try to find a way to sell this. And from there, I just started looking for more things in the tech industry and project management. No one would give me an interview for a project management role in tech, which was obvious. My resume had nothing but retail on it. There was nothing that alluded to the fact that I had done it before. But a lot of what I did in fashion was essentially project management because there was a lot of planning around floor sets and working with clients as well. So I told myself, all right, I need to lower myself a little bit here and maybe I'll do an internship. And ironically, I came across an internship for IT project management, literally the title of the role. And so I said, okay, this sounds right. And I'm going to apply to this internship. And if I'm not mistaken, this was, I don't know if people still do this, but this was when employers were not only just posting on job sites, but still also on Craigslist. And so I found that opening on Craigslist for the internship. And when I applied, I was able to do an interview, which was great. And in my resume, I was only able to put necessarily like my fashion roles, but in the way that I worded what I was doing, I tried to tie that back in a bit more into project management principles. And so when I got the interview, the conversation naturally flowed in that manner. I was able to speak to things that I had done that had that overlap, which was great. But I also made it very clear in my interview that I wanted something that was going to be long-term. So even though this was an internship, this was something that I would hope to one day be able to work as a full-time employee. And I ended up getting the role, which was great. Even better, it was with an organization that I would honestly say hands down was the best place for me to work starting out in tech. And that organization is a Consumer Technology Association. And so for those of you who are really into tech, they're the ones who do international CES. I think it just happened in Vegas this week. If not, I think this week or the week prior.
Yeah, it just happened.
And so, yeah,
just
so
like
I worked
big
there.
Consumer like show where
Yeah.
they announce all the new laptops and fridges and TVs and stuff. Yeah.
Yep. So I worked for that organization and I worked in the IT department there. So I was fully immersed in tech. It's kind of like when you're learning a new not programming, but like a new foreign language. And people say, if you go live amongst the people who speak that naturally speak that language or natively speak that language, it'll be a lot easier for you to understand it. It was the same way because I was immersed in tech, like all around me. I really got to know a lot more about working in the tech industry. And I specifically worked in the IT department. And so starting out in that particular department, it was a really good experience because my manager The first task that I had to do, it was for, I think we were transitioning, we were either rolling out a new website for all of our consumer product, like all of our products we had like research and such, or it was working with this help desk that we were rolling out. I know I had both of those, but in either case, whatever the two, or the reason why I was doing this, in any case, my manager had me do was she had me go to the offices of everyone that was like executive and VP level to get their input. So you have this person that's fresh out of college, fresh out of working in retail, literally folding t-shirts the other day. Now I'm going into the offices of folks who sits on the perimeter of an office. And so if you're familiar with the corporate office setting, the important people sit on the perimeter of the office, you know? And so now I'm going into their offices and meeting with them to discuss things related to the project. And I'm really happy I had a chance to do that, because from there on, for the rest of my career till today, I've primarily found myself having to speak with those individuals who are with levels way higher than me in the corporate hierarchy. And so it was a lot of that during that internship, a lot of taking on projects that I was leading. And in 3 months, I was offered a full-time position there. The first of my internship class that I came in with, or cohort that I came in with. And I was excited. I was very happy about it. And that was when I had my transition over here into the tech industry. And also, I will say, even though like having more money was my goal, I went from like, how much was I making? I was making, I believe it was like 18 an hour when I was in fashion. And then when I came into tech, we were looking, I think I first started out like 47K, and I thought I was rich. And that's 47K USD. And so from there, once I like got to like the 50s, like you couldn't tell me anything at that point, but it was more money, you know? And granted, that was like many years ago, but I mean, I felt like I had accomplished something, and that's how I came into tech.
Cool. And I mean, like one of the things I'm really curious is like it's probably like imposter syndrome knocking at your door a bunch of times.
Yes, yes, definitely. And a lot of it has to do, one, with not understanding what folks are talking about. That was something that I had ran into when I was now working there full time in that first job, because we had a team of developers there who were responsible for building out the different tools that we were building for the organization. And me being that person that served as that project manager, I had to go speak with the other folks in the org where we needed their requirements from them. And so I would bring back their feedback to the developers, and then they're just saying things where I'm just like, I don't know what you're talking about, but okay. But I just had to be honest with myself, that I didn't know. And so for me, personality wise, if I don't understand something, I'm going to speak up. I know that's not an easy pill to swallow for everyone, but I'm going to ask what someone means. And so I went to the guy that was like our lead developer, and I had told him, I said, I need to get better at being able to translate what you're saying over to this other group. But, you know, there's also things that I just don't understand. And upon me telling him that, he was very understanding, and he worked with me to bring that level of understanding of what it was that his team meant by like this or that, and what these different terms were. And then I was able to then, for one, understand what was going on. And then two, I was able to find a more non-tech way of explaining that to folks who weren't technical. And so speaking up in that instance was probably one of the best things I could have done for myself while in that particular position. There were some instances where I didn't, go ask every 5 minutes what like this means or that means. And so what I would do in those cases is just take the initiative and go onto the internet to try to figure things out. And that was very helpful as well, because that then gave me the experience of just seeking answers on my own, especially in situations where you don't have someone that can just feed you all the answers. But I mean, I would be lying if I said that like I always felt comfortable. I feel that there's always going to be moments where you may feel uncomfortable doing something, and imposter syndrome can very much definitely come in and, knock on your door. But for me, being able to ask for help when I needed it, or just being self-sufficient, made a really big difference. And yeah, I mean, even today, I mean, I've been here now for what, 7 years in tech, and there's still some things that give me that sense of imposter syndrome. And the best I can do is just do as much research as I can as possible. And rather than pretend that I know everything, I'll be upfront with people and just tell them that it's something that I don't have an answer to. And if it's something I can circle back with, then sure. But honesty is the best policy, as cliche as that sounds. But yeah.
No, I'm a big fan of like asking stupid, naive questions sometimes to just get an answer. So no, I totally get it. I'd like to move a little bit as to like what you're doing today. Could you explain a little
Mhm.
bit like what your current role is and what you're doing?
Yeah, so today I'm a manager at Microsoft. I lead the Spatial Computing Cloud Advocacy team. And so our cloud advocacy team, we aren't marketing, we're not sales. We're here to help developers by helping them with any of their questions they may have with regards to Microsoft technology and what we have to offer. We're here to also raise awareness, and we're also here to help bring your feedback back to the product teams, so that way they can take that feedback into account as they're making updates and such to the products. For me in particular, being in spatial computing, we partner very closely with the mixed reality team. And that team is famously known for things like HoloLens when I mention mixed reality to people. And so we do a lot with them. Typically for me, and when I'm not necessarily more involved with being like in that manager role, it's a lot of content creation that I do.
Right.
And so I would say in advocacy, if I always mix the percentages up, but I would say we probably do about maybe 80% content creation. And it's all technical content creation, and that varies in terms of like the medium that you choose to do so. For me, it's primarily doing video recordings. I do a lot of live streams for talks on different topics, blog post writing, and tutorial writing. And that's literally what I do every day, outside of all the planning that goes into it. But just being up to date on what's happening in the industry, spending a lot of time in the developer community overall. Pre-COVID, a lot of that involved going to meetups and conferences and such. Now that we're in a more virtual world, a lot of that is online meetups and such, going to different forums where people are engaging with one another to chat with folks there. And because we're not necessarily in a sales role, we don't have that pressure to sell our products, because that's not what we do. We are here to help you out, especially if you are using our products and you want to understand like why this thing isn't working, or like why this particular thing that you heard of from Microsoft might be helpful in whatever you're building. That's what we are here to do. And that's, I would say in a nutshell, is what I do today.
Can you this might sound like a weird question, but can you explain like what mixed reality is? Just like set the
Yeah.
ground, the stage.
Yeah, no problem. So mixed reality, we consider it to be a spectrum. On one end, you have the real world, and then on the other end, you have the virtual world. And so everything between that, there are different realities that you may be familiar with. So like augmented reality would be on one end, virtual reality being the other far end. And then within there, you have all the different things in that reality realm, if you will, between on that spectrum. With mixed reality, it's going to be being able to blend the digital world with the real world seamlessly. So that way digital objects and such can interact with the real world. And I always give the same example every time someone asks. But if I were to have a holographic cube, for example, and I place that holographic cube on my desk that's in the real world, that cube will be aware of that real life desk that I have. So what that means is if I were to put that cube on the edge of the desk, it will fall, because that's naturally how an object would respond in real life, being on the edge of something. And so That's a good example of mixed reality. It's where if you've seen any demos of maybe animated characters running around and playing in someone's real home, but like they're actually like digital characters, that's another example of mixed reality. We're blending those two worlds together in a way that it really gives that sense of realism.
Mm. I'm really curious as to how have you seen this scene change, or even like people's reaction through
Mhm.
COVID? Like, because a lot of that has been just staying at home and digital interactions with people. Like,
Mhm.
and if I understand correctly, you were already working on this before COVID. And so you've
Yeah.
probably seen that transition. And I'm really curious as to, yeah, what it's been like from your point of view.
I will say, starting out pre-COVID, there was something where, as if you were already working in the industry, you were familiar with it. It wasn't like the popular kid at school, but you knew that people were doing it. You knew that people were were meeting virtually in different spaces, as like avatars and such. And then as COVID came to be, that's when you started to really, or at least that's when I started to really see a shift. That's when you start to see different circles of people talking about it that may have never discussed it before. You're starting to see more people who don't necessarily work in tech discuss it before. And then for those who are in tech, you start seeing new products popping up on the scene that supports these sort of connections, interactions with people. And I will say it's one of those things where I think it's really helpful. I personally am neutral on the topic of whether it's good or bad, just given that I can understand the pros and cons of it. There's an idea of being in real life is quote unquote better versus doing everything virtually. But at the same time, if you take into account the fact that not everyone can be in person for things, there's a whole group of people who have been left out in the past because they couldn't physically be in a real world space. So therefore, they couldn't actually participate and engage. And so now those needs are being met, which is great. At the same time, I do understand that that personal connection in person does make a big difference, which is also very important as well. And so that's why, like, for me, I'm like somewhere in the middle when it comes to passing judgment on it all. But today, though, it's just either bigger amplification of existing platforms, or there's new platforms that are coming to be that people are embarking on and taking part in, and they're engaging with it, and they're seeing that, like, hey, there's this other way that we can now communicate. Let's give it a try. And I think just overall that, it's helpful at the end of the day. I'm curious as to whether, if we get to back to a world where we're doing more things in person as we once were, whether these virtual alternatives for meeting will continue. And I feel like, I hope they do. It's great to have that flexibility. It's also great. I know we had announced not too long ago during one of our Microsoft events the ability to bring avatars into Microsoft Teams as an example. And so it's good. I would say, for me personally, I don't always want to get on camera because I might have just woken up and I don't look fabulous that day. And so having my avatar sit in for me is always, good.
Yeah.
But things like that I think are really helpful to have. And just overall, being given that sense that someone is there with you in your space, I think has been really helpful, because even last year, my manager and we've done like a one-on-one in one of the platforms where we're able to virtually be in the same space together. And I could like see him actually moving around and walking. And it was as though he was actually in my office at home. And so it was amazing having that option. I would just hate to see it go away.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of fear, and sometimes people look down on this whole virtual side because, like, in person it's so much better. But I think COVID kind of made a point for it that sometimes, like, people are far away from each other and they still want to interact. I think, like, one of the best things is still being able to do a video call with my mom because she lives in another
Mhm.
country. Like, yeah, it's better to see people in person, but sometimes you can't always. And just those experience getting better, I see that as being a great thing, at least for that. I think there's like a lot of scary sides as well, but I do think that there's a lot of really interesting promises, at least from my point of view, that when I see that, it's about like those exciting things. And my mom has tried virtual reality and thinks it's amazing, for example, and it's really cool to share those experiences as well. um, One of the things I'm very interested in is the kind of like mapping side of things, like scanning things and things like that. Like that's one of the things I've played around with photogrammetry, for example. So like
Mm-hmm.
going outside and just scanning a rock and then being super
Yeah.
excited because you can make a model out of it. And that's like something that's also growing a lot in video games, for example. Like photogrammetry is
Mm-hmm.
becoming this huge thing. Do you see that as well, as like we're going to try to reproduce our world and just make what sometimes we've referred to as like a digital twin? Or do you see it more as like we're just going to create completely different environments, or maybe just both?
I want to say it's both. And also, coincidentally, I did some photogrammetry yesterday. I was scanning some
Cool.
Legos that I have here. So it's funny that you mentioned that. But I feel that it's going to be both. And the reason why I say that is there's different use cases for each one. So I've seen instances where folks will do virtual tours of places that you may not be able to physically get to. So maybe like virtual tours of archaeological sites or famous like monuments and things like that. For something like that, it's, in my opinion, it's better if you have like a real world almost looking like example of what that is. So that I think is great. But then in some instances, you do find folks creating their own worlds of what they feel should be in their environment that they want to have as well. So there is that divide there. If you're taking the approach of recreating things that are in real world, where I think it can start to get a little tricky is a matter of, can you physically actually do that? And so today there is starting to be more platforms and tools available for folks, even just like the normal non-tech folk, to go out and do things like photogrammetry. And then there's also a more technical side as well. So perfect example, yesterday, the app I was using, I think it's called Polycam. And with that, it was literally me just moving my iPhone around my Legos, and that was it. Whereas on the other end, you have Apple Reality Capture. I think that's what it's called. Whereas you can do something similar. You could take a whole bunch of photos of something, but then you have to run everything through Xcode and then you'll get the output. So that one's just like a little bit more advanced. And then then the very far extreme are the folks who actually build 3D models. And so that's going to require even deeper technical skill set to be able to actually, or design skill set more so, to even do the design aspects of it. So I think given these possibilities of how you can recreate models in the world, I think there's more opportunity to do that. A lot of it comes down to the use case. Is this something that people are going to find benefit in doing? And I think for those instances of doing tours, being able to recreate real world places and still engage in those spaces is going to be also where it's really important. As for those however, on the other side that want to create things from scratch, it does give you that autonomy and that flexibility to create what you want to actually create, which I think is really great. You're able to build worlds that don't exist in the real world. Where it gets dangerous, because everything can get dangerous, that's life, is when people start to replace virtual worlds for the real world. And that's when people lose touch with reality. And that's not necessarily good. It's kind of like Inception, not Inception. Was it Inception? The one with Leonardo DiCaprio and his wife, and yeah, it was Inception, where they went to this, this other world, if you will, and his wife unfortunately mixed up reality with the real world, and she no longer liked reality, and she wanted to live in this other world. And I'm not going to spoil the movie for anyone that hasn't seen it yet, even though it's been out for years, but pretty much it didn't end well, you know? And so I think we can unfortunately potentially get to a point for some individuals who rather stay in that virtual world versus the real world. So when it's time to actually encounter people in the real world, they may not take the actions that they should be taking with actual people in the real world, or they may not necessarily be able to socialize in the best manner possible as they would be able to do so in that virtual world. But yeah, I think there's always that fear of folks losing touch with reality that does stay in the back of my mind.
Do you think there's anything that can or should be done to try to prevent
Mhm.
that? Or do you think on the other end, like we shouldn't really do much on the tech side, but there's like other things that we should be doing to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Um, I will say from the tech side, Uh, it's one of those things where I'm just going to be realistic. People are going to do what they want to do. You
Yeah.
can put as many things in place to prevent people from spending all their time in a virtual space, and they're still going to do it anyway. Like if you take TikTok, for example, even though it's not a virtual platform, but the app now, every so often, I think after you've been on TikTok for like a while, they'll have a post that pops up and say, "Hey, you should go take a break because you've been here for like an hour." Even if we implement things like that in virtual spaces, there's nothing saying that you have to leave. You know, people may still continue to stay in there, and that's where I think a lot of the onus does come down on the individual. But I think, however, if we are implementing things like that from a technical perspective, I think it will help some people. I just also want to be realistic and not say that that's like the solution for like everyone. But yeah, now when it comes to like children, for example, I've come across articles and such where that'll suggest that parents and guardians that they do limit their time in these virtual spaces so that way children do know that like, hey, there's a real world that exists here. I think in that instance there's a bit more that like can be done because someone else is in charge. But even so, I feel like people are going to do what they want to do at the end of the day, and we can try to put in as many mechanisms as we want to help prevent that, but just also understanding that there will be those folks who kind of go around those mechanisms and just stay as long as they want in virtual spaces.
I'm quite curious what you think on like you mentioned that part of your job is, if I understood correctly, to communicate with developers. What do you think is the extent that we need to do with like users, where because this is really becoming mainstream in a way. I think the like Oculus Quest to like just before Christmas or like right after Christmas became the
Yeah.
most popular app on the App Store.
Yep.
Like that's mainstream. Like it's selling like millions of units. And so that's more on the
Yeah.
virtual reality. And you know, I might just put everything in the same bucket there, but like that's
Hmm.
entering in like people's lives that most of
Yeah.
them probably know nothing about tech. What to what extent do you think there's also needs to be communication at that level towards people
Hmm.
who are users, and you know, who sometimes it might just feel like magic to you just put this thing on?
Yeah. You just like gave me idea for a really good YouTube series, but
Sure, cool.
I, I think that there is a level of communication that needs to be given to users as well. A big part of it is safety. So I feel like there's enough conversations around like, oh, what games should I download? Like that's fun, but there's also this other side around safety that people need to learn about. Even though things may be fun, even though like whatever app may have the ability for you to do like filters that look cool or ones that might give you like makeup and such, deep down inside there's a lot of safety implications at play there. You're literally giving someone access to your face. And so so like you got to understand, not saying that every company is using that and doing malicious activity with it, but I think people need to be educated on what they need to be cognizant of when they are given permissions to use their camera, for example. The same as being in virtual spaces, even though that's not quote unquote the real world, it is a world where people can still collect data and information from you as well. And so, perfect example, I was doing a talk on safety just before the year ended last year. And one of the sections was on personal identifiable information, so PII. And there was just so many examples of how people can collect data from someone in, ways you may think to be, harmless, but when it's in the hands of the wrong person, there's a lot of bad that can happen. And so you have things like eye tracking, for example. And so you may be thinking, well, it's just my iris. There's a lot that can be inferred from someone's iris. We have things like color, which is a bit more obvious, but then when you have things like eye twitching, for example, that can lead to making different biases about people. There's certain characteristics that can be derived that can even narrow down to like what your race happens to be. There was this one case study where this guy had this video game that did have eye tracking in it. And so the guy was playing the video game with some friends, and then sometime later, if I'm not mistaken, he went to get life insurance. And so unfortunately, he got denied for it. And so it's like, well, why did he get denied for it? Well, what happened was the company that had this video game that he was playing, they were selling their data from the users to insurance companies. And so because they now had, the guy's name, whatever, like email, whatever other information that he provided, they had a whole profile on this guy. And so if I'm not mistaken, I'm paraphrasing here, he was having like eye tremors that were happening, and that was linked to a health problem that's seen, or it's like not a symptom, but something that's seen in health issue that the insurance company wasn't going to, cover as a pre-existing condition. And so because of that, he got rejected. And then to take things a step further, his sister, who never played this game a day in her life, she later went to apply for life insurance and was also rejected for the same reason, because her brother was rejected based on his data that was collected from the app. And so hopefully that's just an extreme example, but I share that because things like this are happening and people need to be aware of that. People need to be aware of the fact that because they're creating a profile on some site, that now your data is sitting somewhere in a database, and hopefully it's not being used for bad. There's, oh my goodness, just overall, there's there's just so many things that people need to be aware of when they are doing things virtually. In social VR spaces is another good example. Abuse can still happen, whether that be verbal or physical abuse. And so, people do still enter spaces and say very mean things to people, which can be, very unfortunate. And some people may think, well, it's not the real world, so it doesn't matter. But no, those feelings still do matter when someone says something, whether it's an avatar or a person in real life. And so there's those aspects of it. What I think needs to also be shared with folks is, what can you actually do when those things happen to you? And so when we think of things like harassment and bullying in virtual spaces, there hopefully for I know some platforms have it, but not all platforms, but you have to be able to know where you can go and report this sort of information. So that way investigations can be done to help rectify whatever the issue is. But what makes that a challenge is, well, what does that look like from a technical perspective?
Right.
What do I then need to implement into my app to make that possible? We just talked about this on a panel last year. I believe it was my manager who also joined me on the panel. He had brought this up. It's like, okay, if you do something of that nature, do I now have something implemented in my app where I can kind of like go back in time and replay everything that just happened in this virtual world? Like, does that exist? And if so, what does that take to build that? And it's a lot. I'll be honest with you. And I don't believe anyone has that resolved yet. But I feel that consumers, they do need to be aware of what they signed up for as they are trying these things out. And, just to be cognizant of, what could happen. But I don't want to scare anyone from trying out VR and AR. But It's kind of like driving a car. You go through driving school, you learn about what could happen if you drive intoxicated or if you don't wear a seatbelt, but it doesn't stop you from driving a car. But it's good to know those things so that way you're aware of it and how to potentially avoid and mitigate it. Same with being in VR and doing stuff with AR. It's good to know what could happen so that way you're prepared for trying to avoid or mitigate things happening.
Yeah, I still think there's a lot of really cool stuff to explore for sure. But I think that's really important. Like, I'm glad we talked about that. Like when we had a first chat, you mentioned wanting to talk about like privacy and like the importance of that. Like, how do you think people should think about it, or even developers actually think about that? Like, where as a user, like facial tracking, that sounds actually pretty cool. Like, I want that. Like, I want to be able to have, let's take an avatar, for example, and it being able to mimic expressions. That's like a huge part of how people communicate. But I don't want that to be stored somewhere where an insurance company can be like, oh yeah, no, your eye twitched, so yeah, no.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah, please.
No, go ahead.
No, that
I'll
was
let you
just like,
finish.
I'm just yeah, my questions don't really go anywhere, so that's where I'm just asking, like, what are you thinking about that? Like, what do you think can be done for that, like both from a user perspective but also from like the people building that?
Yeah. So from the developer perspective, for the people who are building it, as you are planning out the functionality of your app, if you decide that you need to collect data of some sort or have permission of some sort to access certain things on someone's device, I really want you to ask yourself, why do you need it? If it's the case that you need people to sign in with an email address so you can send them a newsletter about all the other games you're creating, I don't know if that's like the best use case. If you are tracking people's like face for filters, for example, yeah, I think that's a really good use case. Otherwise, the app doesn't work. But then the next thing is a matter of, okay, you have this data. How are you using the data? And in my opinion, using it purely for functionality is really where things should stop in terms of functionality for the app to function the way it's intended. When you find yourself in a position as a developer of, should I sell this data or not? I feel the answer should be no, personally. But if for whatever reason you decide, hey, I want to sell this data, I really just want you to think why, what is coming of this. And I haven't done too much in the space of data selling to really provide any like positive use cases as to why people do it. But you really have to consider the moral, I'm going to lose the word I just had in
Dilemma?
my head. I guess the moral dilemma that's at stake when you decide to do things of this nature with folks' data. Same with accessing things such as your camera, your microphone, and location as well. So there's things like for your camera, as an example, that's something you're going to need, for face tracking. Well, as a consumer, there's also the thing to consider of, I'm giving permission to use the camera right now to do this one post, but will the company still have access to my camera after that? Same with webcams. As we're sitting here doing virtual meetings, and if we have an avatar represent us in a meeting, is my camera on after the meeting? And can whatever company that now I'm using this platform with, can they still access my camera? And so those are things to just like really think about from the developer's perspective. Making sure there's controls in place that, you're only using things when you need it and you're using it for positive purposes, not to do negative things with that access that you have. And in addition to that, a lot of it also comes from the developer's perspective, is having a good idea of the people and that are on your team and their character. Because, you as the founder of whatever app could, be a really good moral, outstanding citizen, But it just so happens that one of the developers on your team, they're the ones that's now having a little issues with the moral, the moral obligation to do right with whatever they're building, and now they're off doing something that they shouldn't be doing with the app that you've been, that you're creating. And so having a good idea of who your team is really important. I think that's also why it's important to really vet people that you are bringing on board to help out with apps that you're building. I'm not to say that, like, you shouldn't have your friends come join because you've been best friends for like 20 years. But at the same time, you really have to know who's helping you out build these things as well, because it might not be you that's the problem. It's someone else on the team that's doing things they shouldn't be doing. From the consumer end, though, there's different things you can put into place to hopefully make sure that things aren't being used in manners where they shouldn't. So location-based apps, for example, personally, I only select to share my location while using the app. I know that is a detriment to some apps because then it doesn't function the way that they want by providing like push notifications when I'm at like X location. But at least I feel a little bit safe knowing that it's only going to know my location when I'm in whatever location. Same with camera. With that one, it's a matter of only giving access to the camera when necessary. I know, like on iPhone, there's the option to like access photos and such. So if you are using, I keep using filters because like that one is like top of mind right now. But for a lot of these, a lot of these apps that enable you to take photos of yourself, they have the option to save the photos to your, your photo gallery. In order to do that, they need access to access your photo. Your photos. And so being mindful of when you're giving that access as well. And, in our phones, we have settings to control that. And so getting familiar with those settings is a really big, important thing to keep in mind. But I just think overall awareness is what's important. Awareness of knowing what's going on from that developer's perspective. Just hopefully having a really good, strong moral compass. And if you're working with others, just check in on what they're doing. Check the code, check to see what's happening. And that's my opinion on that.
Right. Yeah, it's sometimes it feels a little bit scary. Like I as someone who's into tech as well, it's exciting to like keep up with, I don't know, like what Apple is doing and things like that. But I think about like all the other people who just are using their phone because they're using their phone. And it feels like there's some sort of like digital literacy that is more and more required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like it again, I keep taking my mom as an example, but
Oh,
like
it's
I feel
fine.
like that's the like prime example of someone on the
Yeah.
complete other end of the spectrum about like sitting down and being able to explain like, okay, look, that app can still track you even though it's closed, but it's actually not closed. But like I find that particularly hard to talk about with people who are outside the bubble that we might be in sometimes. And so I wonder how you think about that as well.
I will honestly tell you, as someone who also has a mother on that other end of the spectrum, trying to get it across that you have to clear your apps out is like the hardest concept to get across. Same with like doing phone updates. I mean, she'll be on like a very old version of one of the iOS versions, and I'm like, you have to update this. There are things that come out in these updates that are going to help further protect your phone, but it can be difficult to bring that level of understanding, especially for someone who's not technical or just has no interest in things tech at all. And it's a challenge. What I have seen in different instances are folks who create these programs where they do meet with, not to call our parents seniors, but they meet with seniors that they don't know much about tech. They spend time with them, introducing them to different things that are tech related. They teach safety and things of this nature. And I really love seeing programs like that when it comes to speaking with our own parents or those in our lives who aren't technical. I think the communication needs to happen at a very low level in terms of how we say things, how we word things. we have to drop the tech jargon when we're trying to help out. We literally have to explain things as though we're talking to a 5-year-old. And I don't mean that to be demeaning, but for folks who aren't into tech, that is likely going to be the best way to get things across, to bring some level of understanding. And I know it might get repetitive, but from time to time, we still have to follow up to make sure that they're still following suit with what it was that we had shared. I mean, it took me a couple years, but now my mom closes apps, which is great. So, so like there's things that do take some time, but I think the way that we express that's really important. And I think for those of us who are more technical, I just feel like we do have that obligation to be able to be that person that can help educate those who aren't as tech savvy, that's using technology. So that way, they are aware, not saying that we have to be the tech safety police, but we need to be able to help and speak up when it comes to things of that nature to try to help people out.
Yeah. I want to like completely change gears here, and I'd like to ask, like, from the whole background and journey that you've had, do you think there's anything that you have from the fashion industry that the world of tech you're in today, the work that you're doing today, can learn from?
Yeah. So since I spent majority of my time in tech in project management and program management, and now primarily community work, there's a lot of the customer service experience I had in fashion carried directly over here into tech. Though I'm not selling clothes, I am engaging with people a lot. And so when I was working as a project manager and a program manager, there was a lot of communication flow back and forth. There was a lot of personalities that I've had to deal with. There was a lot of delivering, good and bad news to people. And so because I was very people focused in terms of actually communicating with people face to face more often, being able to understand how to handle different situations was really important. Fashion, it was the same thing, because in that particular space, it was a matter of like really understanding what people wanted, understanding what they were saying when they weren't saying it. Being able to anticipate things that they would like. When someone's upset, now what is it that I do to help solve the problem? Same thing happened over in tech as a program manager and a project manager, being able to understand people's requirements for whatever product it was that I was working on, and trying to be able to read between the lines on what it was that they really needed that either they weren't saying out loud, or knowing just what else it is that they need in order to get what they expect out of something. Being able to give the bad news when someone needs it, and being able to figure out how to go about um, how to go about being in that situation when they are upset. That's the same things happen over in tech as well. So being able to navigate those relationships and that communication has literally been a one-to-one from fashion and tech. The other thing, product knowledge is huge. And so I mentioned earlier in fashion, really understanding the what, the why, the where, the how is really important in fashion in order to sell merchandise. It's the same way in tech, except now, even though I'm not selling tech products, people are asking me about things about the product. Can I use this with my Oculus Quest, for example? What programming language do I need in order to try things out with this? What sort of specs do I need in order to download and use this? Why should I get this device over another device? Things of that nature. That's all product knowledge at the end of the day. And being able to first and foremost understand the product, and then second, be able to communicate it to folks in a way where you're able to first of all answer their questions, and then also bring that understanding and offer alternatives where appropriate. That's something that I also did a lot of in fashion that I still do today in my role that I have now. And I would also say, in addition to that, there was one more thing. So when I was in fashion within the visual merchandising space, a lot of psychology came into play with that. And so what I mean by it is lie to you not, one day I had a pile of sweaters that, I folded up, made it look all nice, and they were selling. And then it got to a point where it just became kind of stagnant. No one was walking over to the pile anymore and grabbing one. So then I redid the entire display. Displays in the same spot. I just folded the sweaters different. Lo and behold, people started coming in and picking up the sweaters and buying them. And it's like same sweaters, same location, they're just folded differently. And maybe they're in a different place on the table now. And so with visual merchandising, there's a lot of that psychology at play of how people perceive things. And so being in tech, it's similar. If you've done anything around like UX or UI specifically, I would say that plays a really big role. When I was working as a program manager initially at Microsoft, I couldn't even begin to tell you how many conversations we've held about putting buttons on certain places of the screen because those things matter, and understanding that psychology of how like people think and how they interact and act with things is very important. And so those two skills, that skill as well, I would say was something that I was able to carry over from one to the other. And it's just amazing. Like I said, even though, I can't compare fashion to tech like one to one, there is an overlap in the skill sets that are very helpful if you are transitioning from that industry over into tech.
Which happens all the time.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
One of the things I'm curious to also ask about is this notion of branding, and following up a
Mhm.
little bit that story of like those shirts that are folded in a different way. It kind of feels like, it's just the way you're displaying them. And you were mentioning that earlier in the conversation about like how that was such a big thing, like the branding of just the brands that you were working with in the first place, but also the layouts you were doing. How does that also translate into what you're doing today?
Yeah. So I will start off with being that I do work for, I don't work for myself. And so, given that I work for like a company like Microsoft, as a good example, there's a lot that needs to be followed when it comes to branding. And since a big portion of my job is content creation, I can't always do things the April way that April wants it to be done. There is a brand, that I represent. And so I need to adhere to how that brand presents themselves in the real world. And so coming into tech from fashion, I had a really good idea of how strong branding is. I had a good idea as to why branding exists and the importance of it. And so as I came into tech, really understanding how to best represent the company for me was like a no-brainer. Unfortunately, that's not always the case with everyone. And I think that's fair that it's not the case with everyone, because if you don't have that understanding of why branding is important, it can be challenging to grasp that concept as to why you can't go just do things on your own. There's a brand that needs to be protected. And to be realistic, there's money behind that brand. So therefore, it really just takes one person to, to bring down a brand, which is unfortunate, but it's true. And so so that's just one end of it. The other side of it is one thing I hadn't mentioned is I did go to grad school as well for luxury and fashion management. And one of the courses that I did was on branding. And so that's when I really got to be like even more deeply exposed into like theory behind branding as well. And so as someone who does create content, having that understanding has put me in a place where I know what it takes to go out and execute a big initiative and have very strong branding. Having branding is very important because it does create consistency. It also creates this sense of people know that it's, that it's you when they see it somewhere out in the wild, and that is really important for growth, definitely, and familiarity. So branding as a whole, I would say, that's why I was very fortunate starting off in fashion to understand the importance of it. And then coming into, tech, especially now being at a much larger company, understanding why it's so important. And I will say for anyone out there who is coming into the tech industry, it's not always a matter of doing things the way that you want it to be done. There's a reason why certain things are done a certain way. And at the end of the day, it's to protect the company and their brand, which directly relates to also the money behind the brand as well. So yeah.
Let's go a little bit on the content creation side. Like,
Yeah.
what does that look like? What are you doing on that front?
Yeah. So content creation is so much fun. It's honestly how I got into being in advocacy. When I was looking for a new role, when I was ready to just transition out of doing project management and program management, I at the time was creating a lot of content for fun, just after work. And it was primarily Python content. And then one day I said to myself, I could just do this full time. I would be really happy with that. And then lo and behold, I found my job that I have. And now that's literally what I do full time. Creating content for me is like creating art. And that doesn't necessarily have to be like what would be traditional art, like a painting or something. But it's a matter of creating something, even if it's something like a tutorial, for example. Just the other day, I did a TikTok for the Visual Studio Code TikTok account that explains how someone can use Babylon JS and VS Code. And so like something like that, even though it's instructional, you can still make it engaging and fun. What I like about content creation is that it does open that door to creativity for me. And that's something that I deeply crave, to be very happy at work and what I do. And so right now, what I am working on is a video series that I'm doing with the Microsoft Reactor. It's a 10-part series that's centered around helping people with getting started with their extended reality development journey. And so just yesterday, we actually had an event where I started off with explaining the different approaches you can take, as well as an understanding of, what hardware is available, SDKs are available, frameworks are available, and then just some general advice for starting out. Coming up in like 2 weeks, I'm doing the next session on like how to plan your app. And so that's one set of content that I'm working on. Another thing that I'm working on that I'm bundling up now is a workshop that'll be happening soon for Microsoft Power Apps. So putting together all the instructions, the scenario as well. I've been working on that and then placing it nicely into like a GitHub repo so people can access it and do it on their own as well if they aren't able to attend a workshop. In addition to that, let's see, what else am I doing this year? There's some projects I'm doing with like our mixed reality toolkit team that I can't talk about quite yet, but it's another package that's being added to the mixed reality toolkit. So like even that's content as well. And I want to say top of mind, those are the main things I am doing right now for this year. There's talks that come up here and there. I have a talk coming up, or a panel for metaverse as an example. And it varies, I would say, from time to time. I just actually recorded a episode for Learn TV yesterday as well. So a lot of what I do is on camera. That's my preferred, but there's also kind of that balance with writing as well. But that's what I have happening so far, I will say, for this year. Yeah.
And a podcast here and there.
And yeah, I know, right? Yeah, and a podcast here and there. Podcasts are the most fun. They're honestly the most fun because I feel like podcasts give me the chance to speak from my own perspective, which is something that I don't need to do research for. It's nothing that I have to be perfect for. Even though, like, I definitely think before I talk, it's not something that I have to spend hours upon hours getting ready to do. It's like having a conversation with someone. And I can't think of a more natural and pure way to communicate than just a conversation. And so that's why I like doing podcasts.
I mean, I'm really biased towards that as well. So I'm happy that you're thinking about it like that. I want to start rounding things off here. And I like finishing off asking the same question all the time, which is like, if there's anything that you might have read recently or come across, and it can be books, podcasts, anything actually, that you've come across that you think is just interesting and worth sharing. And this, doesn't have to do with anything that we talked about. Just, I like asking that question about like recommendations for things like that.
Yeah, so I'll give you two. I'll give you one that's more tech focused and then one that's just like random that I stumbled upon. So the first one, something that's a bit more tech focused and related to the area that I work. There is starting to be an emergence of influencers becoming more into the metaverse space. And so there's opinions all over the board about how people feel about that work in tech, and I get it. But at the same time, we also have to realize that's a market that if you're interested, consider doing research on what's happening in that space because influencers at the end of the day, they're not, for the most part, they're not going to be technical. There's some that are, but when we really think about the stereotypical influencer, they're not going to be technical. They're going to need help. That's where a lot of folks who are in tech can help come into play to help them out. And so there's been a variety of different articles here and there online. If I were someone interested in just looking into that a bit more, I would search the term influencers in metaverse, because that's where you're going to find articles to see what's happening. You may be able to be that person that jumps on something a lot quicker than everyone else, and there may be opportunities there. The other thing I came across yesterday, Business of Fashion. They are a platform that's all dedicated to the business side of being in the fashion industry. They posted an article on their site with regards to fashion, metaverse, and NFTs. And so it was about luxury brands who are currently hiring for folks to lead their metaverse related efforts and things related to NFTs and Web3, for example. So if you are a person who happens to be interested in trying to find a role at this point in this space, and you have the experience of being, that sort of developer or designer as well, check out that article from Business of Fashion. If you go into their site, literally search the term fashion and NFT, and the article will pop up. What's interesting, though, from when I read the initial post about it, is that, believe it or not, a lot of these companies will actually believe it because there's no way they could do it. But a lot of these fashion brands are not looking for someone that has like experience, because no one has experience in metaverse right now. So unlike traditional programming jobs where they ask you for like 12 years of doing this and that, in the fashion industry, there's not that hard requirement. I mean, obviously you have to know how to like create something, whether it's AR, VR, but there's opportunity. So if you are looking for jobs, consider looking into that. And then non-tech related that I found interesting. So I'm not sure if I shared this when you and I first met, but I've been learning French. And what I've done just recently, I think it's here. So I've been reading The Little Prince, and I have
Yes.
the French English version. And so I've been reading a French page and seeing as far I can get with translations, and then looking on the English side afterwards. So for anyone that's into like foreign language learning, especially if it's French, I cannot recommend that like enough. That's been really good. And then I also discovered LingoPie recently, and they have a variety of different TV shows and different languages that you can watch. And the app itself, if you turn on the subtitles or the captions, you can click on a word in the caption, and it'll add it to this like list of vocabulary that you didn't know. And it'll also show you what the word is on the screen. And so just yesterday, I was watching like a kid show in French and trying to see how far I can get with understanding. And it's a really good app, especially if you're trying to further your retainment, I would say, in practicing and listening comprehension and reading comprehension in a language. I can't remember how many languages they have, but I do know for sure French is one of them. And those are the things I would say have been the most interesting lately.
Oh, that warms my heart. The Little Prince is one of my favorite books, and I
I
think
love
it's,
it.
yeah. I'm of course very biased being French to read it in the original way it was intended, and like I think it's pretty on topic. Like Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author, like he's a very multifaceted person as well. He's written a lot of books, like on very different genres. Actually, on like he was a pilot,
Yeah.
and that's why the character in The Little Prince is also a pilot. And so yeah,
Yeah.
it just I could ramble on forever, but this really warms my heart. I think it's a great book, and I'm very happy it gets recommended.
perfect. Yeah.
Thank you very much for spending some of your valuable time with me. This was a really interesting, insightful conversation. I'm very thankful that you took the time to explain your journey.
Oh, no problem. I appreciate you reaching out and having me here.